Picture this. A baby, less than a year old, lying inside a small plastic tub, being held gently by a 20-year-old with long hair who was only just becoming famous. Nobody in that room had any reason to think this baby would ever matter to football history. That 20-year-old was Lionel Messi. And 19 years later, that same baby would stand across from him in a World Cup final, on the exact night that ended Messi's last realistic dream of lifting the trophy again. This is the story of what happened after the final whistle. Not the goal that decided the match. Not the trophy lift. What happened right after, in a quiet corner of a stadium in New Jersey, while almost every camera in the building was pointed somewhere else entirely. By the time the two teams walked out for the 2026 World Cup final, the whole tournament had already been building toward this exact matchup for weeks, almost as if the sport itself wanted it to happen. Billboards across New York City carried both of their faces side by side. Pundits kept describing it as a passing of the torch before a single ball had even been kicked. In a strange way, both men had been walking toward this one night for nearly 2 decades without either of them fully realizing it. To understand why the moment after the whistle matters so much, we need to go back a long way first, because none of it makes sense without the history behind it. Back in December 2007, a Spanish newspaper, the Barcelona Foundation, and UNICEF organized a charity photo project to raise awareness for children in need. For the shoot, they picked a baby, chosen almost at random, born in the town of Mataró, close to Barcelona. That baby's name was Lamine Yamal. In the photograph, a young Messi, not yet the legend the world would come to know, holds the baby gently in his arms inside a small tub, smiling at the camera. It was just one photo, taken for a good cause, meant to be forgotten within a year. Nobody in that room could have guessed what it would come to mean nearly 2 decades later. That baby grew up fast, and not in an ordinary way. He entered La Masia, the very same Barcelona academy that shaped Messi as a boy. He made his first team debut as a young teenager, breaking club records along the way and becoming the youngest player to ever appear for Barcelona's senior side. At 16, he helped Spain win the European Championship, becoming the youngest player ever to score at a Euros tournament in the process. By the time he turned 18, he was already being talked about as one of the most exciting players on the planet, a genuine Ballon d'Or contender before he could legally rent a car. He had already played in a Champions League semi-final for Barcelona, and he had already inherited the club's famous number 10 shirt, the very shirt Messi wore for almost 20 years. Left foot. Right wing, cutting inside toward goal. Same club, same academy, almost the same path Messi once walked, except this time everything was happening even faster. And then, almost impossibly, real life wrote a script no writer would dare to invent. The baby from that old charity photo, and the man who once cradled him in his arms, ended up standing across from each other in the final of a World Cup. The date was July 19, 2026. The stadium sat in East Rutherford, New Jersey, part of the New York area, hosting the final of a World Cup being played across 3 countries for the first time in history. The night carried the weight of a global event well beyond football, with a halftime show featuring major music artists performing in front of the crowd before the second half kicked off. But once the players took the field, none of that mattered anymore. Spain against Argentina, for the single biggest prize the sport has to offer. On one side stood Messi, 39 years old, playing in what almost everyone accepted would be his final World Cup match, the closing chapter of a career that had already given Argentina a title in 2022. On the other side stood Yamal, 19 years old, standing on the edge of inheriting the very stage his idol was preparing to leave behind for good. Before we get to what happened at the final whistle, there's something you need to understand first, because without it, the ending of this story loses half its meaning. For months leading into this tournament, Yamal never once tried to put distance between himself and Messi's shadow. Reporters constantly compared the two of them, and instead of brushing the comparison aside the way many young stars might, Yamal leaned straight into it with respect. Months earlier, when he was asked about the possibility of one day facing Messi on a football pitch, he said that if the two of them ever met in a match, there would be mutual respect between them, because in his own words, Messi was simply the best there had ever been. At the same time, he made clear that he had no interest in becoming a copy of Messi. He wanted, in his words, to become the first Lamine Yamal, not the next Lionel Messi. That distinction mattered to him, and he repeated it often enough in interviews that it clearly was not just a throwaway line for reporters. It reflected how he genuinely seemed to see his own career, built in Messi's footsteps, but not defined entirely by comparison to him. That balance, honoring the legend while still building something of his own, is rare to see in someone carrying that much weight on his shoulders at such a young age. This admiration was not something new that appeared right before the final either. Years earlier, as a teenager just breaking into the Spain national team, Yamal had already spoken publicly about growing up watching Messi, once saying in an interview that he had looked up to Messi and Neymar as a kid, and that it felt surreal to now have children looking up to him the same way. That kind of long, consistent respect, repeated across several years rather than said once for a headline, is part of what made the moment after the final feel so genuine rather than staged. Messi, for his part, never stayed quiet about the connection either. In the days leading up to the final, as photos of baby Yamal in that plastic tub resurfaced across social media, Messi called the coincidence something close to incredible. Verify. Exact quote from Messi's pre-final comments. He spoke warmly about the teenager's talent, acknowledging that Yamal was one of the best players in the world already. Two men from two different generations, showing genuine respect for each other before a ball had even been kicked in anger. Now let's talk about the match itself, because for Argentina, and for Messi in particular, the night turned brutal almost from the very first whistle. Getting to this final had not been easy for either side. Argentina had arrived having scored 19 goals across the tournament, one of the most attacking runs of any team in the competition, riding an 8-match unbeaten streak against European opposition heading into the final. Spain, meanwhile, had eliminated some of the strongest teams left in the draw on their own path to New Jersey. Neither team was there by luck. Once the match kicked off, though, Spain controlled almost everything. Argentina had one clear early sight of goal, when Julian Alvarez sent Messi through with only the goalkeeper to beat, but Spain's keeper Unai Simón got there first and cleared the danger. After that, Argentina simply could not create anything more. For the entire 90 minutes of normal time, they failed to register a single shot on target. Not one. Messi ran himself into the ground trying to change that, dropping deeper than usual, chasing every loose ball, playing like a man 20 years younger than his actual age. But Spain's defense, and their goalkeeper gave him almost no room to work with. On the other side of the pitch, Yamal was a constant nightmare for Argentina's back line, forcing defenders to double up on him again and again throughout the match, setting up chance after chance that Spain narrowly failed to finish in normal time. Late in the second half, Argentina's Enzo Fernandez was sent off for a rough challenge on Spanish defender Pau Cubarsí, leaving his team to play the rest of the game a man down heading into extra time. Then, in the 106th minute, Spain's substitute Ferran Torres struck the ball into the net with his left foot. 1-0, Spain. Messi's dream of a second World Cup, the one shot he had left at 39 years old, was officially over. Stop and think about what that moment really meant for him. This was Messi's final World Cup. His last chance, at 39 years and 25 days old, older than any other outfield player to ever start a World Cup final before him. He had carried Argentina through the tournament, scoring 8 goals and finishing second only to Kylian Mbappé for the Golden Boot, and after all of that, he still walked away with nothing but silver around his neck. Across the pitch, Spain swept up the tournament's biggest individual honors, with Rodri named the best player of the competition, young defender Pau Cubarsí taking home the award for Best Young Player, and Unai Simón collecting the prize for Best Goalkeeper. Every one of those trophies, in a way, was built on the same defensive wall that had shut Messi out all night. There was also a piece of history buried inside the result itself. Yamal, at 19, became only the 4th teenager ever to start and win a World Cup final, joining a short list that includes Pelé in 1958, Italy's Giuseppe Bergomi in 1982, and Kylian Mbappé in 2018. His Barcelona teammate Pau Cubarsí, also 19, joined him on that same short list. Every single teenager who has ever started a World Cup final has ended up on the winning side. Messi, on the other hand, had already lived the other end of that story once before, losing a World Cup final of his own back in 2014 at a much younger age, before finally breaking through to win the trophy in 2022. Now, at the very end of his international career, he was tasting that same bitter feeling one final time, only this time there would be no next tournament to try again. When the final whistle blew, Messi stood completely frozen at the center of the pitch, hands resting on his hips, staring into space as if he could not quite process what had just happened. Then, slowly, he sank down onto the grass, pulled off his boots, and sat there watching Spain's players celebrate the exact trophy he had wanted so badly. It is one of those images that sticks with you long after you see it. A man many consider the greatest player of all time, sitting alone on the turf, boots beside him, while a joy that was never going to be his exploded all around him. Around him, several of his Argentine teammates were dealing with the loss in their own ways, some kneeling with their heads down, others standing motionless in shock, the entire squad processing the reality that this specific chapter of the national team, the one built around Messi, had just closed for good. It was not only his personal loss. It was the end of an era for an entire country that had watched him carry their hopes for 2 decades. And this, right here, is where the story that most people completely missed actually begins. While Spain's players scattered in every direction across the pitch, some running toward the stands to find their families, others piling on top of their goalkeeper, celebrating with the wild, uncontrollable joy that only comes from winning a World Cup, Yamal did something completely different. He did not chase the trophy first. He did not run to celebrate with his teammates. Instead, he turned away from his own celebration entirely and walked, alone, across half the pitch, straight toward the one man sitting in silence on the grass. Picture that scene for a moment. A 19-year-old who had just won the biggest prize in the sport, standing at the single most euphoric moment of his young career, choosing instead to walk toward his fallen idol. It would have been completely understandable, and nobody would have blamed him, if he had simply joined the pile of celebrating teammates first. Winning a World Cup only happens once in a lifetime for most players who are lucky enough to win it at all. Instead, he made a different choice in that instant, and that choice is exactly why this story is worth telling. According to Yamal's own account given after the match, he reached Messi, and the two shared a long, quiet embrace, the kind that says more than words ever could. Yamal later revealed that he simply told him, "I'm sorry." 2 words. No speech, no grand gesture, just that. Messi, in return, reportedly congratulated him and told him he deserved the win even more than anyone else on the pitch that night. Sit with that exchange for a second. A legend, in the single worst moment of his professional career, taking the time to lift up the very player who had just ended his dream. That kind of response does not come from politeness alone. It comes from real, deep-rooted respect between two people who understand exactly what the moment means to the other. Almost nobody caught this live. Most broadcasts were busy following Ferran Torres in tears, Spain's head coach Luis de la Fuente embracing his coaching staff, and a tense confrontation building between players from both sides elsewhere on the pitch as tempers ran high after such an emotional final. While all of that chaos unfolded in front of the cameras, this quiet moment happened almost completely unnoticed, off to the side, away from the main spotlight. Yamal later described his feelings toward Messi in interviews as something close to reverence, calling him his idol and saying that moments like the one they shared matter more than football itself, and that Messi would always have his respect. He also spoke about advice Messi gave him during that embrace, advice he said carried as much meaning to him as the medal now hanging around his neck. Whatever the precise words exchanged were, the message underneath them was unmistakable. One era of football was closing, and its biggest star was quietly passing something forward to the player set to replace him. It is worth pausing on how unusual that is. Most sporting handovers happen slowly, over years, through statistics and headlines rather than through a single sentence spoken quietly on a pitch. This one happened all at once, in the space of a hug, right at the exact moment it mattered most. After the embrace ended, the two of them briefly separated and posed together for a photo. Messi stood with his silver medal and red, tired eyes. Yamal stood beside him, his expression carrying respect rather than triumph, no smug smile, nothing rubbed in. Place that photograph next to the one taken back in 2007, baby Yamal resting in a plastic tub in Messi's arms, and you get one of the more striking pairs of images football has produced in recent memory. 19 years apart. In the first photo, Messi holds the baby. In the second, that same baby, now a world champion, is the one steadying a heartbroken Messi. In the days after the final, that pairing of photographs was reproduced everywhere, from newspaper front pages to collectible trading cards, with at least one company producing a special one-of-a-kind card built around the story. It is rare for a single photograph, let alone two photographs taken 19 years apart, to capture an entire career arc so cleanly, but this pair somehow managed it. Here is why this moment carries weight beyond just the emotion of it in the moment. Yamal is widely expected to be seen as Messi's long-term successor at Barcelona, having already inherited the club's iconic number 10 shirt that Messi once wore for nearly 2 decades. He could easily have used this final to put clear distance between himself and Messi's shadow, proving his own identity by keeping his distance from the veteran he beat. Plenty of young stars choose exactly that path to carve out their own name. Yamal chose the opposite. He chose to honor the man ahead of him, even on what was, up to that point, the single greatest night of his career so far. The similarities between these two players stretch well beyond one old photograph. Both came up through La Masia. Both are left-footed. Both play primarily on the right wing, cutting inside toward goal on their stronger foot. Both made their first team debuts for Barcelona as teenagers younger than almost anyone else in the club's long history, Messi at 17, and Yamal even younger still, becoming the youngest debutant in the club's history at the time. It can feel, watching the two of them, like history is repeating itself, only this time running on fast forward. Even their rise through the international game has followed a strangely similar shape, each of them thrust into the spotlight of a major tournament, while still a teenager, each of them asked from a very young age to carry expectations that most adults would struggle to handle, let alone a 16 or 17-year-old still finishing school. And yet, rather than turning any of this into a bitter rivalry, both players have consistently leaned into mutual respect instead. Yamal has openly welcomed being compared to Messi while still insisting, again and again, that he wants to write his own story rather than simply repeat someone else's career. That balance between fierce ambition and genuine humility is rare in modern football, a sport that is often criticized for producing young players obsessed with fame, follower counts, and image rather than substance. Here was a 19-year-old millionaire, at the biggest moment of his young career so far, choosing to comfort a rival instead of posing straight away for the cameras with the trophy. News of the moment spread fast once photographs and player accounts began circulating in the hours after the final. It struck a chord with fans well beyond just Barcelona or Spain, reaching Argentina supporters and neutral fans alike, briefly uniting people who usually spend their time arguing about everything else in football. That kind of reaction says something about the moment itself. Football fandom is often built around division, one club against another, one country against another, but every so often a single image manages to cut straight through all of that noise and remind everyone why they fell in love with the sport in the first place. In the days that followed, murals and street art depicting the embrace appeared in parts of Barcelona, a sign of just how deeply the image had resonated with people, sitting alongside other tribute artwork honoring different members of the winning squad. At least one of those murals was later vandalized, unfortunately, a reminder that even a moment this widely praised was not immune to football's more divided corners of opinion. Still, the fact that artists felt moved enough to paint it on a wall within days of the final tells you something about how quickly this particular image became part of the story of the tournament. Many former players and journalists pointed to that embrace as one of the defining pictures of the entire World Cup, arguably more memorable in the long run than the final scoreline itself. There is a bigger lesson buried inside all of this for both Barcelona and Spanish football going forward. Leadership on a football pitch is not only measured by goals scored or trophies lifted. It is measured, just as much, by how a player treats other people, especially in the biggest moment of their own career. If the next great captain of Barcelona is someone capable of showing that kind of respect on the largest stage the sport has, that says something meaningful about the direction the club, and perhaps the wider game, might be heading in the years ahead. Think about how many children were watching that final around the world, many of them staying up late or waking up early depending on their time zone, just to watch this exact matchup between the player they already loved and the legend their parents had told them stories about. For a lot of those kids, the image they will remember most from this entire World Cup will not be the winning goal. It will be the teenager who walked away from his own celebration to comfort someone else first. That is not a small thing to hand down to the next generation of players and fans. It is a far more powerful lesson than any trophy presentation could ever teach on its own, delivered without anyone asking for it, in front of a global audience of hundreds of millions of people. As for Messi, losing that final clearly hurt in a way few results in his long career ever have. It was almost certainly his last realistic shot at a second World Cup, and it slipped away in extra time after 90 minutes of near-total frustration. But there is a strange kind of victory hidden somewhere inside that loss. He leaves the international stage having been publicly honored, in front of the entire world, by the very player who is set to replace him at both club and, in many people's eyes, in the sport's imagination. He was told directly, by the next great star of the game, that he was the greatest to ever play it. Some defeats end up carrying more weight than trophies do. Messi walked away from that final knowing that everything he built over 2 decades, 3 Copa America titles, a World Cup in 2022, and years spent redefining what was possible on a football pitch, would carry on through players like Yamal, players who grew up idolizing him and are now quietly carrying his lessons forward into the next era. It is worth remembering, too, that this was never really a story about one team beating another. Both sides had given everything across the tournament, and both sides had players who would carry the disappointment, or the joy of that single night for the rest of their lives. Football has a habit of being cruel that way. It does not always reward the player who deserves it most across an entire career. It rewards whoever performs best on one specific evening, and on this particular evening, Spain simply played the better football. That is part of what makes the gesture between Yamal and Messi stand out even more. It happened inside a result that could easily have been reduced to nothing but statistics and heartbreak, and instead, for a few seconds, it became something bigger than the scoreline. When Messi finally turned and walked toward the tunnel that night for what may be the last time in an Argentina shirt, Spain's players were still celebrating behind him with the exact trophy he had chased his entire adult career. One era walking out through the tunnel, another just beginning to rise, briefly sharing the same patch of grass one final time before going their separate ways. So that is the story that most people completely missed while they were busy watching the wild celebrations, the tears, and the tension unfolding elsewhere on the pitch. A quiet embrace between a legend and the player replacing him, a 2-word apology, and a reply that somehow turned a devastating loss into something close to beautiful. Nearly 19 years after that first photograph in a plastic tub near Barcelona, the circle closed in a way almost nobody could have predicted back in 2007, when a family in Mataró simply agreed to let their baby take part in a charity photo shoot for a good cause. It is easy, watching modern football, to become a little cynical about the sport, to focus on the transfer fees, the arguments, the noise around every single game. Moments like this one are a useful reminder that underneath all of that, the game is still ultimately about people, about respect passed between generations, and about a 19-year-old choosing, on the single biggest night of his career so far, to think about someone other than himself first. There will be more finals in Yamal's future, most people expect, and there may be more Ballon d'Or ceremonies, more record books rewritten, more nights like this one where he is the player standing at the center of it all. Bookmakers and pundits were already naming him among the favorites for individual awards within days of the final whistle. But it is worth remembering how he chose to spend the very first of those nights, not chasing the cameras, not grabbing the trophy first, but walking across an empty stretch of grass to comfort the man who made him fall in love with football in the first place. That says as much about who he might become as any statistic, any award, or any highlight reel ever could. Football will move on quickly, the way it always does. New tournaments will start, new rivalries will form, and in a few years' time, people may remember the 2026 final mainly for the scoreline, for Ferran Torres' extra-time winner, or for Spain becoming champions for a second time. But for anyone who saw what actually happened in that quiet corner of the pitch, this will always be the final remembered for something else entirely, a 19-year-old choosing kindness over celebration, even for just a few seconds, on the biggest night of his life so far. What do you think? Is Lamine Yamal really on track to become the true face of world football, or will Messi's legacy always stand completely alone at the top? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if this story moved you, even just a little, hit like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this is exactly the kind of story we love telling here, the ones behind the game that actually matter. See you in the next one.